Margaret sat in her dimly lit living room, hands trembling over an old photo album. 42 years of marriage. 4 decades of loyalty, trust, and what she had thought was love. But tonight, everything unraveled. It had started with a careless whisper. Her neighbor, Mrs. Finch, had let it slip. Oh, dear, didn't you know? People talk, your son's wife and your husband, there were always rumors. Margaret had laughed it off at first. But the seed had been planted, and doubt began to fester. She started watching. Small details became glaring signs. The stolen glances between Charles, her husband, and Olivia, her daughter-in-law. The lingering touches. The unexplained late-night calls. The way Olivia's son, her own grandson, bore an uncanny resemblance to Charles in his youth. Driven by an unshakable need for the truth, Margaret dug deeper. Bank statements. Secret emails. A hidden phone tucked in the back of Charles' sock drawer. And then, an old diary, Olivia's. Every page was a confession. A love that should have never existed. Years of stolen moments, quiet meetings in hotel rooms, whispers behind closed doors. Margaret felt her world collapse beneath her. Her husband, her Charles, hadn't just betrayed her. He had shattered the very foundation of their family. And Olivia? The woman she had welcomed as a daughter had been lying to her for years. That night, she confronted them. The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia's tear-streaked face. Charles' heavy sigh as he lowered his head. No denials. No excuses. Only the weight of their sin hanging between them. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked away, her voice eerily calm. You've both buried this secret for years. Let's see if you can live with it now, and with that, she left them to rot in the mess they had created. The house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that suffocates, that wraps around you like a noose. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of her. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, minutes, hours. Time felt irrelevant now. Upstairs, Charles was pacing. She could hear his heavy footsteps, the way he would stop near the bedroom door as if he wanted to come down and speak to her. But he didn't. Coward. He always had been. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just sex. It was the lies. The years. The fact that he had carried this secret while playing the role of a devoted husband, a loving father. And Olivia, Margaret's own son's wife. How long had she smiled in her face, kissed her cheek, pretended to be family? Margaret reached for the diary again. She had already read the worst of it, but she couldn't help herself. Her hands flipped through the pages until she landed on a date, November 4th, 15 years ago. I told him today. I told him I was pregnant. He looked at me like he wanted to run, but he stayed. He promised he would take care of everything. I know it's wrong. I know I shouldn't love him, but I do. I always have. Margaret's stomach twisted. Her fingers dug into the paper. Olivia's son, Michael. Margaret's grandson. But was he? Or was he something else entirely? A sound pulled her from her thoughts. The creak of a floorboard. She looked up, and there he was, Charles, standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes full of something unreadable. Say something, he muttered. Margaret exhaled slowly, feeling an unfamiliar calm wash over her. She stood, walked past him without a word, and made her way upstairs. In the hallway, she stopped outside Olivia and her son's old room, the one they had stayed in before moving out. She opened the closet. The box was still there. The one with the old photos, letters, keepsakes. Her hand hovered over it, hesitating. Then, she lifted the lid. And there it was, proof. Proof that Olivia had been in love with Charles long before she had even met Margaret's son. Margaret's fingers curled around the edges of a photograph. Young Olivia, no older than 19, sitting on Charles's lap, his hand resting intimately on her thigh. The date scrawled on the back made Margaret's blood run cold. A year before Olivia had even married into the family. Margaret's breath shuddered. Everything had been a lie. Every single thing. She clenched the photo in her fist and turned back toward the stairs. This time, she wasn't just going to walk away. Charles was still standing in the doorway when Margaret came back down. His face was lined with exhaustion, with guilt, but not fear. Not yet. He didn't know what she had found. She held up the photograph. His eyes flickered to it, and for a split second, something crossed his face. Recognition. Regret. Maybe even shame. But then, just as quickly, he masked it. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret almost laughed. That was what he cared about. Not the betrayal, not the fact that their entire marriage had been built on a lie, but how she had discovered it. She stepped forward, pressing the photo against his chest. "You were with her before she married our son." The words came out steady, colder than she thought possible. "You loved her before she was even part of this family." Charles didn't deny it. Didn't even flinch. "Yes," he said simply. Margaret felt something snap inside her. A deep, bitter ache that had been simmering for days, weeks, years. "And Michael?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "Does our son even know?" Charles swallowed. That silence was answer enough. Margaret turned away, gripping the back of a chair for support. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Her own grandson, no, not her grandson. Her husband's son. Her son's half-brother. Her stomach twisted. "You disgust me," she said, and this time, her voice shook. "All these years, you let me believe we had a real family. You let me love that boy. He is your family," Charles interrupted, his voice rising. "You raised him like he was yours. What does it change?" Margaret spun around, her hands trembling with fury. "It changes everything. You let our son raise your child, his own wife's child. You let me love a lie. And Olivia? Did she know? Did she know before she married him?" Charles's silence was deafening. Margaret staggered back, pressing a hand to her mouth. Of course Olivia knew. She had married into this family knowing exactly what she was doing. Knowing exactly who Michael's father was. The room tilted, the weight of it all crashing down on her. "Where is she?" Margaret asked suddenly, voice sharp. Charles hesitated. "She took Michael and left." Margaret's head snapped up. "She what?" Charles rubbed a hand over his face. "She knew you'd find out eventually. She didn't want to face you. She didn't want Michael to know the truth." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, now she wants to protect him. After ruining his entire life." Charles sighed, but there was no remorse in it. Only resignation. "It's done, Margaret. It's over." Margaret straightened, her breath evening out. "Over? No. This wasn't over." She turned and walked to the phone. "Who are you calling?" Charles asked, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. Margaret didn't look at him as she dialed. "Our son," she said, her voice calm. "He deserves to know who he's been married to." Margaret sat with the phone pressed to her ear, her pulse pounding with each ring. 1. 2. 3. Then, click star. "Mom." Daniel's voice was groggy, laced with sleep. "It's late." "What's wrong?" Margaret opened her mouth, but the words lodged in her throat. How did she say it? How did she shatter her son's life the way her own had just been shattered? Mom. Daniel's voice sharpened. Are you okay? She took a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table. No way to soften it. No way to make it hurt less. It's Olivia, she said finally. She's gone. Silence. Then a rustling noise, like Daniel had sat up in bed. What do you mean, gone? Margaret closed her eyes. She left. She took Michael. Another pause. Then, Daniel let out a confused laugh. Okay. I mean, we've been having problems, but she wouldn't just leave. Did she say something to Dad? Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. She didn't say anything, Daniel. But I know why she left. A breath. Barely audible. Mom, what's going on? Margaret turned, locking eyes with Charles. He was watching her, arms crossed, his face carefully blank. He thought she wouldn't do it. Thought she'd back down. Protect him. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She's been lying to you, Margaret said, forcing steel into her voice. For years. About everything. Daniel let out a short, uneasy laugh. What the hell are you talking about? Margaret's voice didn't waver. Michael isn't yours. Silence. A long, gaping silence. Then, what? Margaret's hands shook. He's not your son, Daniel. She exhaled. He's Charles's. The other end of the line went completely still. Then, just a single breath. Short. Ragged. What did you just say? Margaret glanced at Charles again. He was still unreadable, but there was something in his eyes now. Something dark. She turned away. I found out tonight. I found everything. The affair started before Olivia even married you. She and your father, she swallowed hard. They never stopped. The silence stretched so long that Margaret wasn't sure if Daniel was still there. Then, suddenly, crash, the sound of something shattering on the other end of the line. A ragged breath, something between a sob and a growl. She lied to me, Daniel whispered. Margaret closed her eyes. Yes. Another crash. Then, he lied to me. Her throat tightened. Yes. Daniel let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It didn't sound like him. Where is he? He asked suddenly. Margaret froze. Her eyes flicked to Charles, who had straightened now, watching her like a man who knew the noose was tightening. Daniel, where is he, Mom, his voice was ice. Margaret hesitated. Then, slowly, he's here. Silence. Then, a quiet, deadly promise. Don't let him leave. The line went dead. Margaret lowered the phone, her heart hammering. Charles took a step forward. Margaret, she lifted her chin. He's coming. For the first time that night, Charles looked afraid. The air in the house had changed. Heavy. Electric. A storm waiting to break. Margaret placed the phone down, her fingers stiff, her mind whirring. Charles stood across from her, his face pale, his lips slightly parted like he wanted to say something, but what was there left to say? Nothing. She turned away and walked to the sink, gripping its edge. The kitchen clock ticked, loud and steady, counting down the seconds before everything erupted. Charles finally spoke. Margaret, listen to me. His voice was lower now, almost pleading. She didn't turn. No, you listen. Her fingers dug into the counter. You've lied to me for 42 years. Lied to our son. Built a life on filth and betrayal. You don't get to talk your way out of this. Silence. Then, Charles exhaled slowly. He's not going to handle this well. Margaret let out a dry, humorless laugh. No, I imagine he won't. Finding out your wife was sleeping with your father tends to ruin a man. Charles took a step closer. His voice was careful now. Margaret, think about what you're doing. She turned sharply, her eyes flashing. What I'm doing, the rage inside her surged. This isn't me, Charles. This is you. This is Olivia. The two of you did this. And now, it's time for you to face it. Charles held her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was something beneath it. Something calculating. The house fell into silence again, thick and suffocating. Then, the front door slammed open. Margaret flinched, her heart jumping into her throat. Charles stiffened. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. And then, Daniel. He stood in the doorway, his face flushed, his breath uneven. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body rigid with fury. His eyes locked onto Charles, burning with something dark, something raw. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, Charles sighed and straightened. Daniel moved so fast Margaret barely saw it happen. His fist slammed into Charles's jaw. A sickening crack. A grunt of pain. Charles stumbled back, crashing into the kitchen table. Margaret gasped. But Daniel wasn't finished. He grabbed Charles by the collar and threw him against the wall. You bastard, his voice was ragged, shaking. You took everything from me, Charles groaned, blood trickling from his lip. Son, listen, Daniel hit him again. Harder. Don't you dare call me that, Margaret rushed forward, grabbing Daniel's arm. Stop. Daniel was breathing heavily, his body trembling. His knuckles were bloody. His chest heaved. Charles slid to the floor, coughing. He looked up at his son, something almost like regret in his eyes. Shut up, Daniel growled. The room felt like it was collapsing. Margaret swallowed hard. Daniel, she tightened her grip on his arm. Enough, for a second, she wasn't sure if he'd listen. Then, slowly, his muscles relaxed. His fists loosened. His breathing steadied. He stepped back. Charles stayed on the floor, his head tilted against the wall, eyes dark and unreadable. He wiped his bloody mouth with the back of his hand and let out a shaky breath. Daniel turned to Margaret. His voice was quiet now. Low. Deadly. Where is Olivia? Margaret hesitated. She left town. Daniel's jaw tightened. I need to find her. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Daniel, but he was already walking toward the door. And something told her, this wasn't over. Margaret stood frozen, watching Daniel storm out the door. Daniel! She called after him, but he didn't stop. His car engine roared to life outside. Then, tires screeched. He was gone. Margaret felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. Charles groaned from the floor, wiping the blood from his mouth. Let him go, he muttered. He needs to burn it out. She spun toward him, her rage flaring hot again. You don't get to tell me what my son needs. Charles gave a bitter chuckle and looked up at her. He's not just your son. Margaret's stomach twisted. Shut up. But the words were there now, hanging in the air like poison. Charles wasn't just Daniel's father. He was Michael's too. Her grandson. No, her husband's son. She turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead. Everything felt wrong. Her skin, her breath, the walls of this house that had once been her sanctuary. Charles sighed. What do you want me to say, Margaret? That I regret it? She spun back to him, fury burning in her chest. You should. You destroyed our family, Charles held her gaze. No, the truth destroyed our family. Margaret's breath caught. He was right. The truth had torn everything apart. But that didn't mean he wasn't to blame. She grabbed her coat. Charles frowned. "Where are you going?" She yanked open the door. "To stop our son from making a mistake he can't take back," then she was gone. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. The road blurred past him, streetlights streaking through the rain-covered windshield. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the words in his head. She lied. He lied. "Michael isn't mine, ****. He pressed harder on the gas. He had called Olivia's sister, forced the truth out of her. Olivia was at a motel just outside town. Hiding. Running. Coward. Daniel turned onto the highway, the rain hitting harder now. He didn't care. He needed to see her. Needed to hear her say it. Needed to watch her break the way he had broken. Minutes later, he pulled into the motel parking lot. The neon vacancy sign flickered above him, buzzing like an insect in the dark. He killed the engine. Sat there for a moment, his breath shaking. Then, he got out. Room 112. That's what Olivia's sister had said. Daniel walked up to the door, his soaked shoes squelching against the pavement. His fingers curled into a fist. And then, he knocked. Silence. Then, the faint shuffle of feet inside. A pause. Then, the door cracked open. And there she was. Olivia. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, dark circles under her swollen eyes. She had been crying. Good. She saw him and gasped. Daniel, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. She stumbled back. Say it, he growled. She blinked. What? He slammed the door shut behind him. Say it, his voice cracked, raw with rage. Say the words, Olivia. Tears welled in her eyes. Daniel, please, Michael isn't mine, his chest heaved. Say it. She shook her head, her body trembling. I never wanted you to find out like this, God, you're pathetic, he spat, stepping closer. You let me believe, he let out a bitter, broken laugh. You let me raise him, her breath hitched. He is yours, Daniel, maybe not by blood, but in every other way. Shut up, she flinched. His hands clenched at his sides. He had never hurt her before. Never even thought about it. But now, he could feel it. The rage, the betrayal, the absolute devastation twisting inside him like a knife. He turned away, running a shaky hand through his hair. I loved you, his voice was quieter now, but just as broken. God, I loved you, Olivia. And you, he let out a sharp breath. You were screwing my father the whole time, Olivia sobbed. It wasn't like that, Daniel barked out a laugh. Then what was it like? He turned back to her, his vision blurring. Did you love him? She froze. That was the answer. Daniel let out a shuddering breath. Jesus, he stumbled back a step. You did. She cried harder now, covering her mouth with her hands. Daniel's chest caved. His breath was ragged, sharp, like he was drowning. He had lost everything. His wife. His father. His son, no, not his son. He turned toward the door. Olivia stepped forward. Daniel, wait, he paused. But he didn't look back. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. I never want to see you again. Then, he opened the door and walked into the night. And Olivia? She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Margaret pulled into the motel parking lot just as Daniel was walking out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, mist rising from the pavement under the dim glow of the streetlights. Daniel stood there, motionless, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Margaret barely recognized him. He looked hollow. Like something inside him had been ripped out and replaced with nothing. She stepped out of the car. Daniel, he didn't react. Didn't even blink. Margaret moved toward him slowly, careful, like approaching a wounded animal. Daniel, talk to me, he finally turned to her. His eyes were red, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. It's done, he said flatly. Margaret searched his face. What did you do? He let out a short, humorless laugh. Nothing. Nothing at all. He shook his head, staring past her into the night. And that's the problem, isn't it? I should have done something. I should have made them pay. Margaret exhaled. They'll pay, Daniel. One way or another, Daniel's lips curled into something bitter. Not enough, he turned toward his car. I need to go. Go where? He yanked the door open. Away, panic flared in Margaret's chest. Daniel, please. Don't disappear. Don't let them take any more from you than they already have. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something raw, vulnerable. But then, just as quickly, he smothered it. I'll call you when I can, he muttered. Then, without another word, he slid into the car, started the engine, and drove away. Margaret stood there, watching his taillights fade into the night, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. Then, she heard it, soft, muffled. A cry. Her eyes snapped toward the open motel door. And there, on the floor, curled into herself like a broken thing, was Olivia. Margaret's fists tightened. The sight of her should have made her feel powerful. She should have felt satisfaction. But all she felt was exhaustion. She stepped forward, slowly crossing the threshold. Olivia flinched at the movement, looking up at Margaret with wide, tear-streaked eyes. Margaret stared down at her. You ruined my son, her voice was calm. Dangerous. You took his life, his love, his family, and you ripped it apart, Olivia sobbed. I didn't mean to, you did, Margaret's voice sharpened. You meant every second of it. And now, you'll live with it, Olivia looked away, shame coloring her face. I loved them both, her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know how to stop, Margaret let out a slow breath, shaking her head. You never even tried, she turned, stepping out into the night. Goodbye, Olivia, she didn't wait for a response. Didn't need one. Because as far as Margaret was concerned, Olivia was already gone. The house was dark when Margaret returned. Charles was still there, sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He didn't look up when she walked in. Didn't acknowledge her at all. Just stared at the amber liquid, slowly swirling it in his hand. Margaret stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping from her coat. She was tired. Bone-deep tired. But there was one last thing to do. She stepped forward. Daniel is gone, Charles let out a slow breath. I figured he would be, Margaret studied him. You don't even care, do you? He finally looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with exhaustion. Of course, I care. Margaret scoffed. You cared enough to destroy him, Charles exhaled, setting the glass down. I never wanted to hurt him, Margaret crossed her arms. But you did. And now? You've lost him. You've lost Olivia. You've lost everything, Charles held her gaze for a long moment. Then, quietly, I still have you, Margaret laughed. A short, sharp sound. No, Charles. You don't, something flickered in his expression. Margaret, you think I could stay? She took a slow step forward. Sleep next to you. Breathe the same air as you, his face tightened. We've been married for 42 years and every one of them was a lie, silence. Then, Charles reached into his pocket, pulled something out, and slid it across the table. A single silver key. Take the house, he said. I'll go. Margaret looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time in their marriage, he had nothing left to hide behind. No charm. No excuses. No manipulation. Just a tired, broken man who had finally run out of places to run. And somehow, that felt like justice. She picked up the key. Good. Then, she turned, walked up the stairs, and closed the bedroom door behind her. Charles sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty glass in front of him. And for the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to lose. The morning came gray and silent. Margaret woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, soft and steady. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of everything settle onto her chest. Daniel was gone. Olivia was gone. Charles would be leaving soon. And after 42 years, she would finally be alone. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind thick with exhaustion. She had spent years ignoring the quiet voice in the back of her head, the one that had whispered that something was wrong. That Charles was never fully hers. She had silenced that voice with faith, with love, with denial. And now, there was nothing left to silence. She dressed in silence, pulling on a warm sweater, slippers. When she stepped into the hallway, the house felt different. Lighter. She went downstairs. Charles was by the door, a small bag slung over his shoulder. His suitcases were stacked neatly beside him. For the first time in decades, he looked like a guest in his own home. Margaret met his gaze. "You're leaving early," Charles exhaled, nodding. No point in dragging it out, she didn't respond. Just stepped into the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The routine felt strange, knowing he wouldn't be there tomorrow. Or the next day. Charles shifted, rubbing his jaw. "I didn't think it would end like this." Margaret sipped her coffee. "You never thought about the ending at all, did you?" Silence. Charles sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Where will you go?" Margaret let out a quiet laugh. "I'm not the one leaving, Charles." Something flickered in his eyes, regret, maybe. But it was too late for that now. He nodded once, then picked up his bags. "Goodbye, Margaret." She didn't answer. Just watched as he walked out the door, down the steps, and into the car. And just like that, he was gone. Margaret sat at the table, staring at the empty space where he had stood. Then, slowly, she exhaled. For the first time in 42 years, the house was hers. And strangely, unexpectedly, she felt something she hadn't in a long, long time. Relief. The house was quiet. Not the suffocating kind of quiet that had settled over Margaret in the past few weeks, thick with secrets and betrayal. This quiet was different. Lighter. She moved through the room slowly, running her fingers along the old wooden furniture, the framed photographs lining the walls. Some of them she'd take down. Some she'd leave. Not for sentiment, but as a reminder of what she had survived. She made her way to the living room and stood by the window, watching the rain slick the pavement outside. Charles was gone. Daniel was gone. Olivia had disappeared into whatever corner of the world she'd chosen to hide in. Margaret had spent her entire life being someone's wife, someone's mother. But now? Now she was just Margaret, and she found she didn't mind that at all. She walked to the fireplace, where the old family portrait still hung. The one taken on Michael's first birthday. Daniel, beaming with pride. Olivia, her smile a little too perfect, her eyes hiding something no one had seen back then. And Charles, standing behind them all, his hands resting on Olivia's shoulders. Margaret stared at that detail now, at the way his fingers curled so slightly into Olivia's dress, possessive. It had been there all along. She just hadn't wanted to see it. She reached up, pulled the frame from the wall, and, with one final glance, let it drop. The glass shattered against the floor. Margaret exhaled. No regret. No hesitation. She stepped over the broken pieces and walked into the kitchen, pouring herself another cup of coffee. For the first time in 42 years, there was no one else to take care of. No one to lie to her. No one to betray her. Just her. And finally, that was enough.